Hey friends, it's Pastor Scott coming to you as our life groups are thinking about how our small groups can have a great impact in our life, in our community, in our family, in our world, in our church. So many ways that we see throughout Scripture where God was able to use just a little thing to do something great. In Matthew's gospel, he actually talks about the idea of different kinds of faith. There were those that had no faith. There were those that had great faith, and then there were those who had a little faith, just a little faith. But that little faith was like a mustard seed that God was able to turn into something great. In our story that we think about this week in our group and that you heard the sermon about this Sunday, we're looking at the little bit of faith that a woman had when Jesus was passing by. It's really an incredible story. And so in that story, it's such an important story. It's actually recorded in three of the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record this story. And it talks about Jesus' healing power, but it also emphasizes the faith of this woman. So in the passage, it's fairly familiar that Jesus is walking by and the woman is thinking, if only I can touch the hem of his garment. But let's set the stage just a little bit here, because Matthew, Mark, and Luke each emphasize a different aspect of this story. In Matthew's gospel, where he's looking at the idea of those who have little faith that becomes great faith, he drops the story right into the chapter 9, where several things are going on. First of all, Jesus heals a paralytic, and then he invites Matthew to join the disciples, and he dines with the tax collectors. So someone that had a physical deformity from birth, someone that was a tax collector that was touching money that had images of Roman deities and the emperor, all of those were considered to be unclean. So the religious leaders said, Jesus, what are you doing? Touching these people, being with these people, eating with them. The whole idea is that Jesus is crossing these boundaries and actually being with those that are unclean. Then we have the leader of a synagogue comes and says, my daughter is sick. And Jesus is making his way. And as he's making his way, he comes across this woman. So what happens with the woman? She's the one who wants to reach for the hem of his garment. Jesus is using these things to teach his disciples. And at the end of Matthew 9, he gives a teaching about the harvest is ready, but the workers are few. In other words, he's pointing out to the disciples, hey, look, paralytics, tax collectors, the woman who needs to be healed, the daughter. There's needs all around you. Guys, open your eyes as my disciples see the needs and go out and meet them. In Mark's gospel, he's emphasizing the power of Jesus. In Mark chapter 5, it starts with Jesus healing the demoniac and casting out evil spirits. Then, on his way to raise Jairus' daughter from the dead, he encounters this woman. In Luke's gospel, there's a whole section that is actually emphasizing the fact that Jesus ministers not just to men, but to women as well. Luke chapter 8 starts off with talking about the women that were part of Jesus' discipleship group. So it's cool that all three of those are using this same story to emphasize different aspects about discipleship and about Jesus' ministry. But as we think about this, so this is a prayer shawl, or what's called a talit. And on the prayer shawl, it would be worn for a time of prayer, and it's white linen and it has the blue stripes on it, made exactly the way this is described in the Hebrew Scriptures, in Numbers chapter 15, Deuteronomy 22. You'll look at those passages of where it talks about the prayer shawl. The idea was this, that you would wear it, and when it was time for prayer, normally you would just have it on. When it was time for prayer, you could put it over like this and close and have a time of prayer. And it becomes like your own private tabernacle to meet with God and the presence of God. But it's not just for prayer. There's also some very symbolic things. So each of the four corners have on there these tassels where there are knots. And if you look at all the different knots that are tied, there's a total of 613 different knots that represent the 613 commandments that are in the Torah. And in Numbers, it talks about that the talit, and especially the knots on the corners, are a reminder that as we obey God and live out the commandments, That is what makes us in fellowship with God. So a tradition began to develop that the Messiah, when the Messiah comes, would be so close to the Father, so devoted to following the commandments of God, that their righteousness would actually be, there would be power in their prayer shawl, in their garment. And if you were to grasp the hem, or what's called the tzitzit, the fringes of the tassel of their prayer shawl, there would actually be power in that. So here's this woman, and all three Gospels tell us that she's had an issue with bleeding. Probably something along the lines of a menstruation, but it's been happening for 12 whole years. In the Torah, the whole tractate Midot, which talks about impurity, says that actually made this woman unclean. For 12 years, she couldn't go to the temple. She couldn't go to the synagogue. She was excluded from the covenant people of God because of this impurity. So it wasn't just a physical problem that gave her pain, which it did, that she'd tried to go to physicians to have it healed, but it actually was a barrier that kept her from worshiping God. But she believed in Jesus. Her little faith, when Jesus was walking by, if I can just touch his prayer shawl, if I can just grab the fringes of his garment, it's a statement of her belief that Jesus was the Messiah. So as Jesus walks by, sure enough, she grabs that. Jesus stops and says, power went out of me. Who touched me? The disciples say, the crowd's all around you. What do you mean? But Jesus realized what has happened, and he finds the woman and tells her, your faith has made you well. The faith that she had in Jesus, who at this point had not died on the cross, had not risen from the dead, but she believed so passionately, her little faith led to her being healed. All three Gospels say that she was healed in that moment. She was delivered from that disease. Now at this point, Jesus hasn't died and risen again, so we're not talking about a salvation, but it is leading to the fact all three Gospels want us to understand that when we have faith in Jesus and what he did on the cross and rising from the dead gives us healing, deliverance, and salvation. So as you read these passages in your group, I want you to look for the ways that it speaks to us about the power of God and how our little bit of faith allows us to access that power, that salvation, that hope, that deliverance that we have in Jesus. So may God be with you as you read these powerful passages together.